Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Walsh Martin. I'm a scientist, consultant, and cell and gene therapy drug developer who also happens to be a sailor. In May, perhaps even as you're watching this video, I'll be joining the crew of Sail for Epilepsy as we cross the Atlantic from Florida to the Azores on a 50-foot sailboat with our captain, Phil Hayden. Captain Phil founded Sail for Epilepsy with a goal to reach out to patients with epilepsy and encourage them to take one more step to broaden their horizons towards achieving a fuller life with the necessary safety measures in place. You can find out more about this journey on our website, sailforepilepsy.org, and even follow along with the boat's location. In parallel, I've been chronicling about epilepsy via the ASGCT blog, specifically around the latest efforts to develop gene therapies for patients with syndromic and non-syndromic monogenic epilepsies. In that blog series, we cover an overview of these diseases and how gene therapy may play a role in helping patients. Also, we've dived into the current unknowns for these development programs and how drug development teams are working to understand them and advance them into the clinic. Today, though, we're going to be taking a different tack, and we'll be hearing the perspective of a caregiver on these efforts. And for that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Amber Freed, who is the founder and CEO of SLC6A1 Connect, which is a patient organization focused on a particular form of monogenic epilepsy caused by mutations in the SLC6A1 gene. Amber started this effort to help her son, Maxwell, who has such a mutation. Maxwell is 5 years old today, but here's a short video of him from when he was 2 years old as the family was beginning their journey.
The only thing I ever wanted in life was to be a mother. And like a lot of people, it was harder than we thought it would be. With a lot of prayer, 2 years of IVF, we finally received the news that we were having not one, but two precious little babies. And it was the happiest moment of my life.
Where are we going, Mark?
We're going to the hospital.
I went into labor early, and we were so nervous. And the moment I heard Maxwell's cry changed me as a person. The day we received Maxwell's diagnosis, I went back to work. I told them all something really bad has happened and I have to leave right now. And I didn't even grab my earbuds. I just walked out. And I didn't know what I was going to do or how I was going to do it, but I knew I was going to do it. I knew I was going to help Maxwell and every other child with this disease. Maxwell was diagnosed with a rare disease that was so rare it didn't even have a name. It's known as SLC6A1, which is the genetic location. At the time of the diagnosis, we were told he was one of 50 in the world and that nothing could ever be done. And just go home and give him the best life you can. Between the ages of 3 and 4, these kids develop a debilitating form of epilepsy, and then they regress because there aren't any drugs that can treat the epilepsy well. So his neurological system will essentially be on fire with no way to help him. I will fight and advocate for him to the death, and if something can be done, I'm going to do it. So I just looked right back at the doctors and I said, if this were your son today, what would you do? And they said, start calling scientists. Every scientist said, have you thought about gene replacement therapy? It looks like this disease can actually not only be treated, but cured. There was one scientist in Texas that we identified as our man. He's extremely busy, nearly impossible to get his attention. So I started sending him Uber snacks and snapshots of Maxwell. I found out he was speaking at the National Institute of Health at a conference. I took a red eye and I just showed up. And there he was sitting in the front row. And I walked right up to the front row and I just sat down next to him and was trying to play it cool. And he turned to me and he said, "Hi, Amber." And I said, "Hi, Steve. Can we go out to dinner tonight?" And after a 4-hour dinner, we had a plan and we were gonna cure this disease together. The cure is actually created now.
Welcome, Amber. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Great. So I think to start things off, it'd be great if you could share a little bit about Maxwell's journey and your own journey, sort of navigating therapeutic options for his illness.
Sure. So I had beautiful twins in March of 2017. And very early on, I noticed that Maxwell wasn't hitting key milestones, especially compared to his sister, who was sitting right next to him. He missed milestone after milestone, developed very strange stereotypes, and he never used his hands. He felt very floppy when I held him. I would go to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician would say, "Amber, you're a really type A, nervous new mother." And that was all true, but mother's intuition is stronger than a freight train, and I just knew something more was wrong. I was finally referred to a genetic counselor in the genetics clinic at Children's of Colorado, where we went through whole genome sequencing, and Maxwell was diagnosed with SLC6A1.
And you know, I can imagine just on that journey, there was the period of sort of not knowing what was going on, but then when you sort of had at least an inkling of what was going on, that wasn't sort of the end of the journey for you, was it?
No, it wasn't at all. It was actually just the beginning. So my husband and I sat in that cold, sterile room with a lot of doctors with very sad, empathetic looks on their faces. And they said, "He's diagnosed with SLC6A1 and nothing can or will ever be done." And it was a moment of confusion because I said, "Okay, what's the name of the disease?" And we went back and forth because I had never even heard of a disease that didn't have a name. And once I realized that he was number 34 in the world with this gene, and there was only one 5-page paper existing on it in the world, my husband started to just sob uncontrollably. But it was at that moment that I realized that anything that could or would ever be done was going to be us. And the great news is nobody can do things better than a mother. And I decided I was going to fight like a mother. I was going to fight like the third monkey on the loading deck to Noah's Ark, and it just started to rain.
Yeah. And so you founded the SLC6A1 Connect, and through that, you know, you found more patients, right, who are also have these mutations, and you've also tried to move forward therapeutic options for patients with these mutations.
That's right. And one of the first things we learned, like one of the first big aha moments, was that this isn't a super, super rare disease. It's actually more common. It affects 1 in 38,000 live births in the US. And the disconnect was we weren't on genetic testing screens. All of our diagnoses were coming from whole genome sequencing. So right off the bat, to learn that there's actually a large community that is
super interesting and motivating because there's so many more people we can help, but it's also a little bit easier to move forward treatments if there's a larger patient population. And so quickly I realized that SLC6A1 was a monogenic, haploinsufficient, heterozygous loss of function that fit into AAV9. And so gene replacement therapy was really the most eloquent solution for our community. And we had Steve Gray from the University of Texas Southwestern signed up within 2 months to carry forward our mission.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. And so, what is your, I guess, impression? I'm curious, maybe of almost a before and after. What was your impression at the time of the benefit that AAV gene therapies might have, and then has that sort of evolved over time as you've seen more and more research around the AAVs?
That is such a good question. So I think as a parent with a really young child, you have so many hopes and dreams when you're holding that newborn baby. And even when Maxwell received his diagnosis, he was 18 months old, and to put a label on him and to hear that there's so much in life he'll never experience and to not know how long he'll live, it's just not acceptable. And I think when a newly diagnosed parent hears that there's a treatment like gene replacement therapy, this is a once and done treatment that replaces the DNA. It feels like such a no-brainer. And of course, the earlier the diagnosis and treatment, the earlier or the better the treatment outcome. So I think everyone is incredibly optimistic. What inevitably ends up happening is that science is inherently risky, and you run into questions that nobody could have seen coming. And so our timetable initially was a year, and we're on year 3 now. So it's taken longer than what any parent would like, and scientist and doctor. But I think our understanding of AAV9 gene replacement therapy has also evolved as well. So I think as your child becomes more sick, the clinical endpoints become somewhat disconnected between what scientists and doctors do. As an example, if Maxwell could ever ride a bicycle with training wheels, if we as a family could go to the grocery store without an emotional outburst that would just cripple our family, that would be a huge heads up for him to have a couple hours of sleep back to back where he didn't wake up the entire family. Families' expectations and dreams are much lower than what doctors and scientists want. Like they want to swing for the fences and to have a 75% reduction in seizures and be able to have kids do a backflip, back tuck, and like play the piano. And I think if you talk to a lot of the parents with the rare epilepsies, seizure reduction isn't even something like, yes, it would of course be nice, but that's not what cripples the family. It's all of the other effects. And I also think now that we have so much data and we know kids that have received the therapy and historical data, we also know that it's probably, although the therapy is once and done, there is still going to be a need for small molecules and perhaps an antisense oligonucleotide. It's not going to be the end of the road, but it most likely would make our lives multitudes easier.
Yeah, no, that that makes a lot of sense. I think, I think sometimes as scientists, the elegance, and you even use that term as well, the elegance of, gene is broken, replace gene, makes one very optimistic. And yet we know that, we're not going to be able to perfectly correct all the neurons in the brain with a therapy like this. And so your point about at the end of the day, there may need to be multiple sort of therapies converge to help these kids and give them the best shot at having meaningful improvements like the ones you're talking about.
Absolutely.
So with that, I think the other thing you sort of touched upon briefly was this concept of, once and done, which is, something that I think we as an industry, we say it a lot. It's sort of a double-edged sword. So once and done, meaning, in theory, you don't have to, get a therapy weekly or something like this, which might be more challenging for patients and caregivers to manage. But at the same time, once and done also means that as of yet, we don't know how to redose these therapies because the way the immune system reacts to them is, likely that a second dose would be somewhat ineffective because there'd be neutralizing antibodies to the AAV that would prevent it from being effective a second time around. And so, one of the things that I always, when I'm sitting on a drug development team for a novel therapy, before we go into the clinic for the first time, one of the things that I think is toughest for those teams is understanding how to identify the right dose to start at in the clinic and what the dose escalation is going to be. Because in the back of my mind always is the, if I'm not giving enough of the virus to correct enough of the cells, what's going to happen for that kid? How will they react to the therapy? And so I'm always thinking in those rooms, how would I feel as a caregiver? Participating in, say, the dose escalation part of a trial before the dose is really set. And we know the dose that's going to give you the best chance at efficacy while also minimizing any of the tolerability issues of these therapies. And I'm just curious, how do you personally think about those things?
It's a super double-edged sword, and I can speak personally that we're all running out of time. Time is our worst enemy, and it's so much harder for caregivers to try and make the decision because, and people involved in advocacy efforts, because we spend so much time fighting for our kids that there's less time to spend with our kids. And there comes a point where we need to move forward for sanity reasons and know that we did all that we could just to have some semblance of a normal life. I think underdosing the first patient will be a practice that happens for a long time because we're all afraid about some unforeseen circumstance or a severe immunoreaction or whatever it may be. None of us want a child to pass away, especially after we work so hard to create the therapy. And I really think ideally you want to be patient number 3 because you have a little bit better idea for dosing and they typically receive a better dose. With that said, the enemy is time. So you really need to weigh your child being sick and waiting for that third dose. And there truly is no perfect answer. It's what works for each and every family after a lot of education.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that very much resonates with me, because on the one hand, you as a caregiver are seeing, your loved one, progress, and we all, I think we all work under the assumption that the earlier that patients can receive treatment, the better. And so you're weighing that potential disease progression against, having a shot at the optimal dose. And it can't be easy at all. And yet for every trial, there has to be for there to be a patient number 3, there has to be a patient number 1 and a patient number 2.
It takes very, very brave everybody, scientists, doctors, patients. It takes an absolute village.
Yeah, I agree. So just with that in mind, how do you perceive the industry is at sort of conveying these risks to caregivers so that they can make informed decisions? And are there areas where the industry is sort of falling down and we should be doing better?
I think there's always room for improvement. I think one way industry could specifically work a lot better with consents and gene therapies is working so closely with the patient organizations, because many times, we're just that. We're the closest to the patient. We understand the endpoints. We understand what affects our community, but we can also meet our community where they are. So as a parent, you sit through consents all of the time, and they nearly send me into a coma. And I'm an educated, informed person, but I just can't hear the legal jargon, and I have bigger things to do. My child is very sick, screaming next to me. And so they're truly not helpful. What is very, very helpful is basic education. Like parents from all walks of life, all backgrounds, asking super basic questions. Like, let's start out with exactly what is DNA and what is a neuron? Like, starting at the most basic level imaginable in a setting where they're not afraid to ask those questions, which is typically amongst patient organizations. And so I think one way that we can do that better is co-hosting more events, using more technology and experts to partner with patient organizations. And healthcare equity is a super, super big topic right now, but really the best way you can arm patients is through education. And then there's so many other factors. If you have a sick child, geography really matters, having multiple sites, taking as much of a burden off of the family as possible, listening to the families, because we tend to, in my opinion, oversimplify clinical endpoints. And I'm just going to beat up on seizure control because it's very measurable and EEGs are easy to look at. However, a lot of the rare epilepsies have newly discovered EEG biomarkers, and it's not until you look at them as an entire group with one epileptologist that this becomes very clear. And it's going to be more and more important to rely on those parent-reported outcomes of behavioral testing, cognition, daily habits of living, caregiver burden. Those are the things that weigh on the families most heavily, but also burden society the most. That's what creates these enormous medical cares and nursing bills.
Yeah. And yeah, I appreciate that. I think, you know, even if these therapies work as perfectly as they can, intervening when we are for these patients, there's still going to be support that's needed beyond that, and also understanding how the therapies actually benefit the level of support needed is sort of crucial for us in understanding how the therapies are working. So if we change the number of seizures, but we don't really have an impact on the caregiver burden, that makes it a complicated argument as a benefit from the therapy, right?
Especially being that AAV9 is once and done as we know it now. And it's going to be very important to drive home to patients and their families that you may not qualify for another trial since you had gene replacement therapy and something better may come along in 2 years. It's just very tough.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So, you know, right now, you know, AAV9 and maybe a handful of other AAVs are sort of the stereotypes of choice in these therapies, where you are trying to, you know, deliver to the brain. You know, that may improve in the following years. We hope it will. We hope our ability to redose may occur. That said, you know, caregivers are having to make these decisions now about participation, and there's a trade-off there between, you know, intervene now and then what happens if something that might have been better comes along later.
Mm-hmm.
So what questions do you recommend that, you know, on that topic that, you know, parents and caregivers ask before they volunteer for these trials? What would you encourage people to ask about?
I think that it should be a semi-long process. In a perfect environment, I would actually have the patients sit through a course about what gene therapy means and how it works, just to arm them with that information. But after that, I think it's very important to make sure that the parents understand the basic science level and are also going to be able to provide adequate care after the gene therapy, because as we all know, that you can receive a gene therapy, and our preclinical results may be great, but you can't put a mouse in speech therapy or occupational therapy. And those follow-up therapies are just essential. Or say they live in a really rural part of the country, will they be able to make it back to a center of excellence for all of that follow-up care? These super practical questions that unfortunately are so important with emerging technologies. I also think that patients need to be extremely aware of what their options are. So something I like to tell newly diagnosed patients that are so excited about gene replacement therapy for SLC6A1, I am very, very truthful. And I lay it out and I say, it's not an option of if, it's an option of when all of these therapies are available. And I believe it is your choice to decide which one is better. And I walk through gene replacement and the pros and the cons and what an antisense could look like that can be repeated. You can titrate the dose, or maybe small molecules are your comfort level. Everything here is a give and take, and there is never going to be a perfect solution, which is why I'm such a large advocate for families deciding what's best.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So I guess just to wrap up our time together, you've told us so much and been so sort of open with your personal journey and also what you hope for other patients and caregivers who might find themselves in a similar position. I guess the last question is, how is the industry doing in terms of communicating the potential for these therapies? Are we nailing the right level of cautious optimism, or do we need to make sure we're not overselling the promise of these therapies?
I think biotech generally does a pretty good job about the potential efficacy of a treatment. Where I think that they super miss the mark is timelines. And I think it's a very big problem because it's false hope, it's emotion, and everybody can deal with a set of facts. But it's very, very frustrating to always hear a year away, or it's a bad stock market, or people left. Like timeline should just be much more realistic. And also, I think that patients have an idea that once there's a treatment, everybody is eligible for that. And it needs to be conveyed that these trials can be very small, 6 to 7 kids, and there's a really good chance your child will not be included. And another thing I tell parents, especially parents driving these treatments forward, is just assume it's not going to come in time for your child, your specific child. So if this is part of your grieving process, if this is the type of person you're wired to be, absolutely do it. But it comes with a price. It comes with taking away time from your child. And when that gene therapy is ready, your child may be too sick to participate, past the age limit, may have some antibodies to something. Nothing is guaranteed.
Absolutely. I think those are excellent points. And I feel like we could talk for the rest of the day and not even touch the surface on maybe ways we can do better as an industry at communicating with patients and caregivers about these therapies. But in particular, your point that it's not like once you get FDA approval of your IND, every patient is getting treated the next day. Oftentimes in those first trials, there's a couple of patients are treated at the first dose level, and then you watch those patients to make sure it was safe and understand its effects on those patients, and then you move to the next dose level, and that takes time to sort of monitor the patients before you take that next group of patients in. And I think if we aren't doing a good job of communicating sort of the realities and real timelines, to your point, that's something we could easily do better as an industry, for sure.
I'm a big fan of transparency.
Yes, and I think we all should be. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experience with us. I think I think like everyone who works on these therapies, we're all hoping that it will have benefit. And we all need to realize we're part of Team Gene Therapy. So It doesn't really matter if we're on, from company A or company B. We should all be working together to make sure we continue to advance better and better therapies, if not for today's patients, then for tomorrow's. Great. Thanks everyone for tuning in.